All right, good afternoon, everyone. Just a few seconds past noon, so it is afternoon. My name is Laureen Avery, and I am with UCLA's Center X, also part of a grant-funded program called the Excel Leadership Academy. And I'm really happy to welcome you here with my colleagues today to talk about a piece of descriptive research that we've been working on that we call the Lone Rangers. I think that the title, the Lone Rangers, might make a little more sense in a little while if you're not familiar with what it's like to teach multilingual learners in rural and remote schools. This work that we'll be talking about centers on some schools in Vermont and Maine, northern Vermont and northern Maine primarily, and happy to have you all for the next hour. So we wanted to start by asking you a question and see what your own thoughts and speculation about this topic is. We know that immigrant families come to rural areas for a whole different variety of reasons from virtually every place in the world. Resettlement opportunities sometimes bring families, small numbers of families or large numbers of families, to very small areas, sometimes resort areas we're seeing in Maine. They may come through federal, state, or community organization sponsored programs. People come for employment also. That includes seasonal farm work, as well as more permanent moves for better economic opportunities like anybody else in the United States. We do find, not surprisingly, that small public school systems are really challenged to respond effectively when there's a sudden influx of immigrant families. I almost feel like they're almost always sudden, sort of unexpected by definition, especially as, you know, when there's turmoil in the world, then new children show up at the doorsteps of public schools. That's one of the functions, is to welcome them. So I wanted to invite you to answer this question from your own knowledge and experience. What unique challenges do you really think that teachers face in these small communities, small schools, when they are rather suddenly tasked with working with multilingual learners? And you can do that through Mentimeter. You can scan the QR code that's in the upper right-hand corner. You could go to menti.com and enter code 15730836. And I can drop the link in the chat box for you as well. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to respond to that. Knowledge, right in the middle, and in big, yeah, always our biggest challenge, right? Yeah, and clearly seeing some overlap, lack of many things, lack of resources, lack of professional learning, lack of background, curriculum, training, resources. So many of these communities, they're not only removed from an urban center, but they may be far removed from a university or even a small college, places where there might be experts in residence, hard to tap into. Limited FTE, yes, training, time, always, right? If only we had more time, think of what we could do with all of our extra time. So yeah, cultural awareness, that's right. You know, when there's a lack of exposure on the part of school personnel and the community, and so many of these, like you'll hear the stories, so many of these are small numbers of families that come from, you know, last month it was Afghanistan and this month it's Ukraine. a whole host of resettlement going on from African nations. It's, yeah, so. Okay. So this is what we'd like to talk about today and like to leave you with when we're done. We'd really like to explore a little bit who the multilingual families in Northern New England are. Who are the folks that we're talking about and what brought them to this area? And sort of more focused, what are the unique challenges of being a Lone Ranger? That's a term that came from several of the teachers. We heard it initially from one teacher who is working in one of these schools and use that to describe himself, that, I'm a Lone Ranger out here, I'm by myself and saving the world. There you go. So what is it like to be a teacher in that situation without a lot of experience, without local colleagues or peers? What is the life of a Lone Ranger like in this instance? If you do have questions, thoughts, things you want to share as we move along, we will leave time at the end for discussion, but please feel free to drop things as they occur to you into the chat box. If it makes sense to stop at some point and address something that comes up, we'll do that. We'd like to keep this engaging and informal as much as possible. So, please drop them. I'll be monitoring them as we go along. So as they occur to you, put them in the chat. And I'm going to introduce myself now and then turn things over. I told you my name is Laureen Avery. My friends call me Reenie, and I invite you to do that as well. I am the director of the Northeast Regional Office of UCLA Center X. That's part of the Graduate School of Education at UCLA, and it focuses on teacher support and development. I'm located in New England, and most of our work is here in New England. The Project Excel, the Excel Leadership Academy, is a grant-funded program that we have run through Center X since its inception in 2007. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jason Cervone.
Hi, so I'm Jason Cervone. I'm also with UCLA Center X and centered here in New England. The project director for Excel, which mostly means it's the paperwork and reporting, but and I also have a bit of a background in rural research. So this was really a chance to kind of bring my personal interests and then the work we're doing with Excel together for this rural iteration of Excel. Chris?
Hi, well, I'm glad you're all here, everyone. My name is Chris Clouet. I served as a bilingual teacher in elementary school in Bridgeport, Connecticut for a number of years. I lived in Brazil for many years, so I experienced what it's like to be immersed in a culture where people are speaking a language that is not something that and that was a great experience, of course. I served as a school superintendent for many years in several districts, and I am currently a professor of education at Mitchell College in New London. And it's been a delight to work with Reenie and Jason on this project.
Okay, so before we get into the heart of the presentation, just a little background on what Excel is. The Excel Leadership Academy is a program that we have developed over a decade now with various sites across New York and New England, providing professional learning for teachers to work with their multilingual learners. We know there's kind of the term English learner can be a little fraught. Depending on relations of power and where it's coming from. And unfortunately, we don't really have a better term for it. So we kind of go back and forth between English learners as, the official definition and multilingual learners as something a little more, I think has more of a little positive connotation. But regardless, the focus is on mainstream classroom teachers who have language learners. The idea behind it is that, the students learning English don't belong to the ESL bilingual teacher. They belong to everybody, and everybody should have this background in linguistic development. So participants can earn micro-credentials through the Bloomboard platform, and also graduate credit through the UCLA Extension School. So teachers who go through this program do earn something out of this. The professional learning is competency-based and job embedded. This isn't, we try not to do too much outside of the classroom. We like to focus in on your students, what you're working with, and learning with your own community of teachers. So the context of this study, this is Northern New England, so it's very small, mostly white schools, English dominant, obviously. And also these are fairly stable communities. Families tend to stay there for generations, but also quite a bit of economic diversity. So you have large populations of working class people, but also, vacation homes and resort owners kind of people. Families come for a variety of reasons. In fact, we did not find a single driving force behind why multilingual learners would be in communities. They can come from work in various fields. Some just want to move to Northern New England. Some are former refugee resettlements, kind of expanding out into new areas in New England. The teachers that we spoke to are mostly volunteered for working with English learners, as most did not have the background, but kind of did this because it was a need that the school had. Others are, say, volunteered. For example, global language teachers, well, you know how to work with language development, you can work with English learners now. So, but again, without that background in formally working with multilingual learners. So the significance of this study that we went through, we see the need for teachers who work with small populations need to understand language development, as well as, the socio-cultural and diverse backgrounds of their students. So many of the students were new arrivals to the country, and they need the support even beyond learning the language. So it's really getting to the whole student social emotional backgrounds. And we hope that the findings can provide an understanding and maybe a guide for teachers who don't have this background, to improve their own practice and create a welcoming and opening environment for students and their families in the community. So kind of our literature review, there is the rural education field is fairly small. The rural education field with regard to English learners is even smaller. Maria Cody has done quite a bit of work, though, that really illustrates that students who are learning English are not limited to a geographic location. Obviously we have the large urban populations, but there's still a number living in rural areas. And there's a difficulty in aligning practices and policies with rural ELs, given the variation in the populations. What works for one English learning population will not necessarily work for another when we take into the various cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Other research has shown school leaders have real difficulty in creating and maintaining ESL programs, simply due to limited resources. Rural schools generally have pretty tight budgets as it is, so making that work for a population that is so small is even more difficult. And many rural teachers have said they just don't have the access to culturally relevant instruction that is needed for their students. So our methods, this study was an investigation to classroom practices and pedagogies of English language instruction, as well as community perceptions. We spoke to 13 teachers across Northern Vermont and Maine. 11 were mainstream classroom teachers or specialists, and one was the district EL coordinator. And we spoke to one community partner who has done quite a bit of work with schools in her community. We obviously recognize two major limitations when it comes to generalizing our results. First is the sample size. Like 13 teachers across New England is not representative of rural in general, or I should say it's not generalizable. I think it is representative that we have teachers in small contexts, like with very different, even being so close together, have these very different experiences. So another limitation is communities selected. Some schools only had a handful of English learners, some only had one, and some said, well, I had one last year, but not one this year. And we also recognize that community-wise, many places in Vermont and New England skew more socially liberal than the rest of the United States, which really can affect the perception of students in these schools. And I will turn it over to Chris now for some of our findings.
Thank you, Jason. So our conversations were rich. The individuals we spoke with, to a person, felt that they had, in fact, received good and very solid teacher training, but little or none of that was for the purpose of supporting ELL or MLL students. And so this was a source of frustration. Some had world language experience, and I had that experience myself. So I had a connection with the teachers that we spoke with, having been kind of pressed into service by virtue of being a speaker of another language, Portuguese in this case, right? Some of the teachers also used their special ed experience to help support the students that they were suddenly working with. And again, the people that we talked to did it with caring and loving kindness that was really notable. But there was a feeling that they were lacking the tools. So they had the desire, but lacked the tools. If we could go to the next slide. There was generally a good feeling about how the administration in each school supported the work, and an acknowledgement. Not one of the respondents that we spoke with said that they felt that there was a coldness or any kind of negativity at all towards supporting the EL students that were entering the school. So they felt that was very positive. And as any of us who have served as teachers know, that is an important piece of the school community. But they did note that there was some perception on the part of not most, but some people asking questions like, and quotation marks are needed here, why are they here? And some of the parents from some of the children in the school would ask, why is this change happening? So there was some feeling, not the majority, but there was an undercurrent of individuals that felt that there was some reluctance to embrace the stranger, to accept the outsider, and that was part of their challenge. But they, as teachers, were full on committed, loving the kids, supporting the kids, looking for more resources. Can I go to the next slide? So, as I mentioned, there was that conservative undercurrent that exists, unfortunately, in my opinion, throughout the country, and certainly was something that you can see in places like rural Vermont and rural Maine. Again, just wanted to underscore, not everyone feels that way by any means, but there was that undercurrent which had an influence on the teachers. So the idea is that they're ready, they want to do it, they really feel like this is an important part of a changing United States, they being the teachers, and it was very gratifying for us to hear the passion that they brought to it. We go to the next slide. Thank you. So the issue of connections, policies seem to be disconnected in many ways, but more importantly, resources. That there was just not they didn't have the resources they felt that they needed as teachers that were heartfelt in their work and very professional, I should add. They didn't have a sense of guidelines or what are the learning outcomes that should be expected of the students that they were working with, who are ELL students. So there should be clearer guidelines, and there was a little little bit of a reluctance just to accept national guidelines because of the differences. And one of the big differences is noting the very tight-knit environments that these small schools represent. Some of the schools had 6 or 7 grades and had fewer than 100 children in the school. So these are very tight school communities. And when I say school community in this sense, I mean the community in the school and how people interact with each other. They're very tight. Everybody knows everybody. Everyone knows everyone's name. And that's very important to the teachers. And it seems to us as researchers that this is something that has a positive impact on the children as well, although that was not the focus of our research. Go to the next slide. So there's just a need for a connection between policymakers, people that organize the resources and distribute the resources, and not just resources in terms of things, but also resources in terms of the ability for the teachers, even though they might be remote from each other, to connect with each other and talk with each other about their practices and share best practices.
So I'm gonna jump in, if I might, before we move on to the recommendations. There are a couple of questions that are coming up that I think are sort of go to more to the findings, and just wondering if you know, maybe both of you could take a minute to comment on them. And some of this has to do with what I would call good intentions and kind hearts. And whether that's, you know, that's enough. I mean, I think everybody knows it's, you know, it's maybe necessary, but not sufficient. But coupled with the fact that many of these teachers, I think, I'd have to maybe, you know, I don't know if it's many or some, but they're newer teachers in a community where, you know, like the teachers today had the parents of the kids that are in front of them in many cases. These are very stable communities for the most part. And if that's a factor, and what the not knowing what you don't know, you know, what the weight of that is, what the weight of that is in this, in a situation that's very high stakes for children and families, right? So just wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, if I could comment on the question from Don Randolph, are these schools able to access Title III funds? My impression, based on our conversations and on my experience, is that the answer is yes. But part of the trouble is in some cases, the schools lack the administrative capacity to actually access the funds. And in the case where there's only 1 or 2 children that would benefit from the Title III funds, it changes the result that one might get in terms of getting, you know, classroom libraries that are multilingual and other teaching tools, et cetera. Jason?
I didn't quite follow your question. Like what?
I'm just wondering what the maybe the Title III is a way to follow up on it. That even with funding, I don't think that there's any shortage of funding for these schools, but there's such a lack of knowing what to do with the funding, as well as a lack of being able to find staff. Like there's a severe urgent shortage there just are no certified or MLL teachers in these areas. But you know, you've talked a lot about the good intentions and kind hearts and willingness to work hard. Just wondering how much of an impact the lack of background knowledge, you know, or preparedness has here. Is like, how far do good intentions go in this case?
Well, it's my impression, based on our conversations, is that the teachers themselves say that. They say, yes, I care about the children I'm working with, and I'm going to do everything I can, but I need more resources, both in terms of intellectual resources, as in training, et cetera, and actual tools that can be used in a classroom. And then the other issue that came up that's related to what your question is the issue of children with multiple needs. So a child might have linguistic needs, and also might need special needs services, and also might need some mental health care support by virtue of being in a brand new culture where things are quite different than what they're used to, for better or worse. But so that issue of the multiplicity of needs of the students also was something that came up in our conversations.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. So, and I think that question about funding and accessing, funding from the state, Title III funds or wherever, leads directly into the recommendations. And so Jason, I turn things back to you.
Yeah, and with the funding too, like given the different socioeconomic levels of these communities, like, yeah, I mean, some communities might be flush with money and some, like just based on the local property taxes, are not. So you have the idea of knowing how to access those state and federal funds, that's something people need to be taught to do as well. And that doesn't necessarily exist in schools. So to our recommendations, emerging from our conversations, what really stood out, I think, to me at least, was the desire for teachers to do as much as they can and to get more support and more help. And it seems like the idea what really is this foundation, community foundation of teaching and learning that, as we say here, the creation of a community of learners, both teachers and students, to work together, help each other understand the needs of teacher needs, student needs, and work to really build in a school, like almost design a school that can really focus in on that. And there is a challenge with that with English learners when you have a lot of these policies coming from the state and federal level that don't necessarily match the realities that is happening in specific small rural schools. So we suggest, in order to overcome these the isolation that teachers and students feel, is the development of a network of rural EL teachers, to have these structured communications and the ability to share materials and practices, and just working in a professional development sense. Nothing has been as effective in our eyes as putting teachers in a room together to talk things out. Like, we can have all kinds of outside help, books, supports, but without the chance to get together and discuss issues, everything kind of falls to the side. So we think that really the core of this, and it's what we try to do with Excel, is just allow teachers the resources to help each other. Another issue that came up a bit was a lack of a coherent guidelines for what they should be doing with their ESL students. Like, everyone wanted to better serve their EL students, but what they were getting, again, they found that it's not necessarily right for them. So this idea of kind of a rural EL curriculum pedagogy that could be developed like through the ground up, through teachers doing the work to really determine what it is that they need to work with their students.
I wanted to call out the question in there about how do you emphasize that speaking a different language is a strength? And it just makes me think of, I can probably go back to it, the quote from one of the teachers here that, and maybe you could put a little context around this, that this is so important to the teachers that are working with these students, including a teacher who said, my student didn't get credit for junior year and he learned a whole nother language.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think there's much emphasis put on that. I think that's pretty straightforward. Like, you have these students, they learned so much in a year, but if it's not what they were supposed to learn, then somehow that doesn't count.
Right. Right.
And
the teachers that gave voice to that were certainly very disappointed in that, as the quote indicates. Yeah, and certainly the teachers that we spoke to did talk about honoring the languages and cultures of the students and their families. There is an opportunity here, in my opinion, as part of this team. Part of the opportunity is that a school that's very monolingual that suddenly becomes multilingual, that's a real opportunity. And the seal of biliteracy is certainly an example that we have in many states around the country, and certainly, and I've worked with and been part of awarding the seal of biliteracy to students in my own career. Absolutely essential, and gives the children who come with a language background other than English a sense of pride and purpose. And that's obviously very important for the community and for them as individuals.
Some of the teachers also brought up this idea that, having English learners really, it globalizes a small school, like to the extent where, like, some of these towns, people rarely leave. Some people rarely leave the state, but this is the opportunity to really open up the world to the people who are there. And even one quote that a teacher noted that she said, like, well, working with these students keeps me global. It helps me, keep an open mind. And I think that's, like, there's so much that can be learned from students as well as what is being taught to students.
Well, and that gets to the idea, in my opinion, that the schools that we visited themselves are very small school communities. And as I mentioned earlier, that has some advantages, as in everyone knows everyone's name, for instance, that sort of thing. But it also kind of parallel to that, or adjacent to that, is the idea that there used to be a thing called the periphery, right? We'd have the center and then there'd be the periphery. There's no more periphery, right? The world is shrinking. And the teachers, excuse me, that we spoke with were very open to that and very pleased that they could be part of that.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question about sort of what we've been using to work with these teachers, and based on the lack of not even, like, I want to say the lack of available curricular resources and instructional professional learning materials. Although I think what we've seen is that there's not there's not an answer to that. There's not a program. And just at the risk of being a little self-serving, I'll just jump in, and maybe this leads into some work that we'll be doing with Aurora. But we have been working with these teachers through the Excel Leadership Academy, is actually a micro-credential, competency-based approach to professional learning. And we have 12 micro-credentials that address the core competencies, the core skills that any teacher needs to work with English learners. That work is done where it's classroom embedded, so the teachers don't have to go anywhere, and it's embedded in a professional learning community, and self-guided and self-paced and everything. So that's been our solution to, I'm not sure solution's the right word, but it's been our scaffold for helping the teachers in these areas as well as urban areas, but it's particularly, it's really helping to address the very urgent needs to train teachers, who are already working with students, and because it's self-guided and it helps the students right away, and the teachers can personalize it to their own context. So, Jessica, we could certainly, anyone, more than happy to talk more about that. But that is how we've gotten to know these teachers, is through this embedded professional learning.
And to answer your question, like, there really are no specific resources. I think that's one of the issues that came up, is, and the need for kind of a network is, the resources that the teachers were using is basically what they went out on their own and found. It's like everyone had kind of their own, like, well, I read about this, it seems like it works, I will try it. So to create kind of a resource or a network where teachers can actually get together and discuss those resources and find really what does work best is something that needs to exist.
Mhm. Yeah. So I was going to Stephanie, I'm going to get your title wrong, but the director of ESL services and Title III services for the state of Vermont. How was that? Pretty good, huh?
That's pretty good.
Is here with us, and because so much of this conversation, Stephanie's been a very valued partner in the work we've been doing in Vermont and across northern New England. But so much of this, it doesn't even indirectly, it directly touches on what the state departments are doing, because state departments are challenged with, to respond to these very small, remote, diverse needs as well. So Stephanie's just agreed to let us sort of pick her brains for a minute or two, and just wanted to give you a chance to say something from your perspective, Stephanie, about this discussion.
Yeah. So I think my biggest thought when I think about what the Excel program is doing, and what this kind of work is helping with in particular, is in our remote school districts, there aren't providers, EL specialists available. And it's in many districts, and it's hard to find new staff in the best of circumstances. And then trying to get someone to agree to move into a very rural circumstance is just a very challenging situation. And so I really think the way forward, not just in rural environments, but really in a state like Vermont, where we don't have a huge EL population in total, is really the training of grade and subject level teachers with the principals, say micro-credentials like this, to help them understand how to manage multilingual learners in their classrooms, and to help them access the curriculum and develop their language skills. There's only so much that a district can be asked to do. So if you think someone asked in the chat about Title III money for these districts, in a state like Vermont, we receive the small state minimum Title III allocation, and it's a requirement that the grants are meaningful. So if we did it by per pupil amount, it just would not be a meaningful grant allocation in these smaller rural districts. So Title III funds aren't really available in those rural communities. So there's that barrier too. So some of them are completely unfunded with direct funding for EL services. So we are part of the WIDA consortium, which is helpful in some ways. There are some professional learning opportunities available to grade and subject teachers. So we do exploit that, but really, I just so appreciate the kind of work that Excel is doing to help engage more teachers in learning about how to support multilingual learners. Vermont is fortunately a proficiency-based state, so the kind of issues where no one's getting credit for an entire grade, hopefully that's not happened. Hopefully that wasn't a teacher here. If it was, there's a complete misunderstanding in the school about the way our graduation system works here. But and then the other thing I wanted to mention was the seal of biliteracy. I did put that in the chat, but there are also access issues related to that in Vermont. How can we confirm literacy in heritage languages that aren't highly represented? How do we assess proficiency? So that's another question that's completely unanswered. But the big challenges that we face are the lack of colleagues too. I know that was one of the things that people were adding to the Mentimeter early on. And I think one of the nice parts of the Excel program is the way that there's a mentorship relationship with other English language specialists, and they get to meet with each other and share out those resources that you had described. So was that what you were looking for?
Yes, thank you. And I, I thought some of the folks, just based on the questions, might, like if others have questions for Stephanie also.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, and you could always reach her or the other state directors that we work with. And I should say, I must say that the Excel work is funded by the U.S. Department of Education. So so thank you to the U.S. Department of Education for making this funding available. It's having a huge impact where we are. So okay, so Susan Patrick is here also, and I wanted to give Susan just a couple of minutes to chat, and we're really excited because part of the funding that we've gotten going forward is going to support a partnership between Excel and Aurora. And Susan, I'm going to let you talk about the policy issues and where we hope that's going to take us.
Thank you, Laureen. And I just want to say thank you for all of your work. As I'm sure everybody who's here in the session has seen, Laureen's actually been presenting at the Aurora Symposium back when it was iNACOL, really leading this idea of knowing that teachers who are in the classroom, teachers who are already teaching have a set of skills and knowledge, but this is new to them on how to better serve our newcomers and our English language learners. And that I've just been so grateful for your contributions to the field. And it's exciting to see after these years that you've been able to do this study that you're presenting on today, and also look ahead at what's to come. I did see somebody had a question in the chat on, does Excel provide any virtual training? So I don't know if you want to reply in the chat or not, but I'll just say, at Aurora Institute, we have a new partnership with Excel. We have been working on state policy on competency-based pathways, and have done some research, quite a bit of research actually, publishing on state policy and how to advance competency-based pathways for teachers, actually, for modernizing educator preparation. And it may serve to help, as we have teacher shortages, how do you help create like a core set of knowledge and then build through micro-credentials new pathways for new teachers to come in, but for existing teachers to build their muscle and skills and have those micro credentials that are not seat time based, recognized for endorsements and certification like Excel offers in the Excel Leadership Academy. So we're going to be working on advancing the state policy. And any of you that work in this area, we would love to work with you too. But we really feel this is an urgent need for the field to think differently about certification, teacher licensure, credentials, and to help build alternative routes that can better meet teachers' needs and also be flexible. So teachers are able to build the skills that they need in real time. And even in states that have been supporting competency-based pathways for students, and I do want to give a huge shout out to Vermont and their proficiency-based diploma, and to New Hampshire for all the work that they've done. One of the things that New Hampshire did early on is look at where seat time policy shows up in other areas. And I just feel like we need to circle back again and look at how seat time shows up in our teacher certification and credentialing policies, and then where we need to work on updating those state policies to support micro-credentials and competency-based credentials is going to be important. So we're looking forward to this partnership and sharing the recommendations for state policies and working with Excel to help create more exemplars and policies, and feel like there is pent-up demand and interest in states too. So thank you, Laureen.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, so I just want to pick up on that, and it's foundational to this work with in rural areas in particular. you know, funding or no funding, state mandates or no state mandates. People, you know, there just are not people who have the background, you know, or maybe the time and inclination to go away and become certified to work with English learners. And, you know, I mean, the ESOL teachers, there's a national shortage. There's certainly a shortage in all of the New England states. But the shortage when you get away from the urban areas is severe. And they're just, you know, there are students who just go without services because there's just nothing out there. And the flexibility and the willingness of the state departments and the districts and the teachers to work towards this, you know, flexible look at credentialing for teachers, because teachers can earn competency-based micro credentials while they're teaching in site, you know, with I don't mean to imply it's easy, but it is a solution to a problem that has very, very few solutions on the horizon. And, you know, and that comes about, that's part of what led to our partnership with Aurora going forward and really looking at this idea of competency-based, you know, in addition to it being, I think a good way to go forward. It is really a solution to a very urgent problem in small schools across the country. So, okay, we have a couple of minutes left, and I promised we would leave time for questions and discussions and things that you all might want to talk about. So, so I don't know. I guess feel free to drop something in the chat, or I think you could raise your hand. I think I'm able to see that if you raise your hand and would like to say something, or just unmute yourself and jump in. Okay. With that, then, you know, feel free to jump in if you like, but barring any other questions or thoughts, Jason, how about closing thoughts, and then Chris, and then we'll let you go on to your next session.
Well, this is Jessica. I guess I'll just jump in since we have a few minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems to me, I was kind of hoping, is there no resource that y'all guide teachers to for translation? Because when you have the lack of, you know, bilingual staff and teachers, I mean, the most immediate need that teachers and schools have in these rural communities are, how do we even communicate with a student who just landed here from a different country, you know, because we have no documents that are in their language immediately. I don't know. I just think that's the most common sense initial thing. A student
Day one, what do we do?
A student comes into your, like, I'm not familiar with the Excel, but I'm looking through all of the resources, but literally there's nothing on there on how do we make initial conversations with parents and students.
Yeah.
It's so sad to me. I'm like, okay, in the entire United States, there's not one translation services that is teaming up with the U.S. Department of Education so we can have communication. It just is baffling that all of this money is put in there and we don't even have that. I mean, gosh, wouldn't it be beautiful if the U.S. Department of Education has some sort of funding that there are a list of translators that schools can immediately contact. I mean, just simple things. What supplies do you need? You know, where is the syllabus? What time is school starting and stopping? What's the school bus route? All of those are immediate barriers.
Yeah. So, yes, right. And of course, when it's just one student, or one family who often shows up, in the middle of the year, like there is rarely time to prepare and get these things together. I want to say that that we address these through a peer network, a supportive network of teachers, Jason, Chris, myself, like other folks that are involved with this work. We have going back to the recommendations, one of the things that's really helpful, not surprisingly, is the professional learning community, where you have someone, we've set up sort of embedded networks in our system where you have some of our learning teams are virtual because there's not always enough teachers, at a site to make it feasible. The distances are just too great. So we have both virtual and in-person networks, but we have we've set it up so there are facilitators for each site. We have mentor teachers, coaches for each state that we work in right now, for ever so many. So we have sort of a hierarchical level of folks that you can reach out to for, like where you might normally just ask the teacher in the classroom next to you. We've expanded that through virtually across the network. We have several hundred teachers working in this right now. So there's usually someone that's addressed your question. So we do that. And we do bring in, like we are actually doing we haven't gotten very far in the planning yet, so I can't give you any specifics, but we do a couple of workshops. We call them design studios every year. We're doing one this spring on newcomer students, and it's really on, what do you do that first week when with students that show up at school. And we're building it around the things that some of the teachers in our network are doing. We have, a couple of teachers who are a year or two into this and have gotten just, like they've had a lot of luck, but we shy away from the here's an expert answer to this, and lean more towards, well, let's ask one another, because these are not individual problems. And I do want to say, like, I know this is a simplistic answer also, but on the very sort of nuts and bolts, the Google Translate resources for both oral language and written language are really vastly improved now, and lots and lots and lots of our folks use them. There's also translators. Some are free, that will automatically put your website or those informational newsletters, like how to pay for lunch and where to find the school bus, those sort of things, into not just the sort of the big standard languages, but a lot of the smaller ones too. So yeah, so I don't know if that helped at all.
Yeah, I do use Google Translate.
But I think, Jessica, you do make an important point that there ought to be a more systemic national approach to this, so that people could easily have access to these tools and these resources. But I see some people putting up some great stuff in the chat box that is very helpful.
Yeah. Like I know New York State actually offers, I can't remember what they call, there's a system where like if you want to speak to someone in another language, you get a third party on the phone who serves as an interpreter. They also offer all of the state materials, all of the state assessments, everything, is offered in any language that you need, really, as well as they'll also send a translator to the school to help students with state assessments verbally if needed. It's wildly expensive, yeah, so
Yeah, and so sorry, sir, I forgot your name. But yeah, and what I'm more, even talking about is, teachers. I mean, think how much we're orally dictating our instruction. I mean, think of a science class, how are teachers going to translate what they're telling all the rest of the class in English to this one student who just arrived? What's the most user-friendly resource that teachers can use? It's an accessibility issue.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
I'm like,
Part of that.
why is this nationally so complicated?
Right. Right.
What's the
And
most simple accessibility feature when we clearly cannot snap our fingers and have human translators in these rural schools?
Right. Right. And there's, of course, there's a host of instructional strategies that help without having direct translation, that help a lot. And part of the response there is, a student who speaks no English should probably not be in the situation of having to do whatever that assessment is, even translated, because right, it's but yeah, these are real issues. The special ed issues, huge, enormous, and of course it's hard to find people who understand, who deeply understand the interaction of special needs and language development. Never mind talking to a family about it, times 100 in rural districts. Like there just are so few people who can do that. So